Before we begin this journey into one of history's most persistent mysteries, I need you to consider something unsettling. Right now, as you listen to these words, there are thousands of nuclear warheads scattered across our planet, buried in silos, loaded onto submarines, stored in bunkers deep beneath the earth. These weapons represent the pinnacle of human destructive capability, protected by the most sophisticated security systems ever devised. And yet, for over 70 years, something has been visiting these sites, something that moves through our airspace as if our defenses don't exist, something that has repeatedly demonstrated the ability to disable our most powerful weapons with a precision that defies explanation. This isn't science fiction. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is documented military history, confirmed by radar, witnessed by trained observers, and buried in thousands of pages of declassified documents that your government never intended you to see. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about humanity's place in the cosmos and the true nature of the nuclear age.
The story begins not with a sighting, but with a flash of light that changed everything. On July 16, 1945, in the desert plains of New Mexico, humanity crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The Trinity Test marked the first successful detonation of a nuclear weapon, and in that moment, we announced our presence to the universe in the most violent way imaginable. Within microseconds, temperatures at ground zero exceeded those on the surface of the sun. A shock wave rippled outward, and a mushroom cloud rose into the atmosphere, carrying with it radioactive particles that would circle the globe. But something else happened that morning, something that wouldn't become clear for years. We had triggered a response. Within months of Trinity, reports began filtering through military channels of unusual aerial phenomena near nuclear facilities. These weren't the flying saucer stories that would later capture public imagination. These were quiet, internal reports from scientists and military personnel at Los Alamos, the birthplace of the atomic bomb. They described lights in the sky that moved with purpose, objects that hovered silently over restricted areas, craft that defied the laws of physics as we understood them. The pattern established itself quickly. Wherever nuclear weapons were developed, tested, or stored, these phenomena appeared. It was as if humanity's entry into the atomic age had flipped a switch, activating a surveillance system that had perhaps been dormant, waiting for us to reach this particular level of technological development. Think about what nuclear weapons represented in that moment. For the first time in history, humanity possessed the capability to fundamentally alter the biosphere, to render vast regions of the planet uninhabitable, potentially to trigger cascading effects that could threaten all complex life. We had developed the power to wound the Earth itself. And something noticed.
The early sightings were dismissed, explained away as atmospheric phenomena, misidentified aircraft, or the overactive imaginations of stressed personnel working long hours on classified projects. But the reports kept coming. At Los Alamos, scientists who had helped create the bomb began witnessing strange lights performing maneuvers no known aircraft could accomplish. These weren't distant dots in the sky. They were structured objects, close enough to observe in detail, moving with an intelligence that was unmistakable. What makes these early accounts particularly compelling is who was reporting them. These were some of the most brilliant scientific minds of the 20th century, people trained in rigorous observation and skeptical inquiry. They weren't prone to flights of fancy. They documented what they saw with the same precision they applied to their work on the Manhattan Project. And what they documented was the beginning of a pattern that would persist for decades, a pattern that suggested we were being watched, studied, perhaps even tested. The timing is crucial to understand. Less than 2 years after Trinity, in the summer of 1947, the Roswell incident occurred just a few hundred miles from the test site. Whatever actually happened in that New Mexico desert, it marked a turning point in public awareness of the phenomenon. The initial military press release spoke of a recovered flying disc. The retraction came swiftly, claiming it was merely a weather balloon. But the seed had been planted in the public consciousness. Something was happening in the skies above America's nuclear facilities, and the official explanations were beginning to strain credibility.
As the Cold War intensified and nuclear arsenals expanded, the sightings multiplied. The Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, and immediately reports of unusual aerial phenomena began emerging from Soviet territories as well. This wasn't just an American phenomenon, it was global. Wherever nuclear weapons existed, these mysterious visitors appeared. They showed no respect for international boundaries, no deference to military might, no fear of our most advanced interceptor aircraft. The U.S. Air Force initiated Project Sign in 1948, the first official government investigation into what were then called flying discs. This evolved into Project Grudge and eventually into Project Blue Book, which would investigate over 12,000 cases by the time it closed in 1969. The official conclusion was predictable. Most sightings could be explained conventionally, and those that couldn't posed no threat to national security. But buried within those case files was a troubling subset of reports that shared common characteristics. They occurred at or near nuclear facilities. They involved multiple credible witnesses. They were often corroborated by radar, and they remained officially unexplained. What the public didn't know, what wouldn't emerge for decades, was that a parallel investigation was taking place behind closed doors, one focused specifically on the connection between these phenomena and nuclear weapons. Military intelligence officers were quietly noting that the distribution of sightings wasn't random. There was a clear clustering around sensitive installations. The objects weren't appearing over shopping malls or suburban neighborhoods. They were appearing over missile silos, weapons laboratories, and nuclear test sites. This suggested purpose, intention, and a level of intelligence that made the phenomenon impossible to dismiss.
On the morning of March 24, 1967, something occurred that would forever change how seriously the military establishment viewed the UFO phenomenon. Captain Robert Salas was stationed 60 feet underground at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana, serving as a missile launch officer in the Oscar Flight Launch Control Center. His job was to maintain constant readiness of a squadron of Minuteman intercontinental ballistic missiles, each capable of delivering a nuclear warhead across continents. These were among the most sophisticated and heavily guarded weapons systems on Earth, protected by multiple layers of physical security, electronic safeguards, and fail-safe mechanisms designed to prevent any unauthorized interference. The morning began routinely with standard checks and communications protocols. Then, shortly after dawn, a security guard called down to the underground facility. His voice carried an edge of panic that immediately caught Salas's attention. The guard reported seeing strange lights in the sky above the facility, glowing red orbs that hovered silently and moved with an agility that matched nothing in the Air Force inventory. Salas, maintaining his professional composure, initially suggested it might be a helicopter or perhaps a particularly bright star seen through atmospheric distortion. But the guard called again, his voice now unmistakably frightened. The object was directly overhead, pulsating with an otherworldly red glow, and it was massive. Then, in the underground control center, the impossible began to happen. The missile status board, which should have shown a steady row of green lights indicating full operational readiness, began to change. One by one, with mechanical precision, the lights shifted from green to red. Each missile was going from alert status to no-go status, a condition that should have been impossible without direct human intervention or catastrophic system failure. Within minutes, nearly 10 missiles had been disabled. These weren't missiles in a single location. They were dispersed across miles of Montana countryside, each in its own independent underground silo, each controlled by separate, redundant systems that had no common point of failure.
The engineering behind these missile systems had been designed specifically to prevent exactly this scenario. Multiple independent circuits, hardened against electromagnetic interference, protected against power surges, isolated from external signals. Yet all of these safeguards had been bypassed simultaneously, as if by an intelligence that understood the systems better than the engineers who had designed them. Above ground, the security teams were watching the glowing object hover motionlessly over the facility. Below ground, Salas and his fellow officers were watching their weapons systematically shut down. The immediate aftermath was controlled chaos. Engineers from Boeing, the contractor responsible for the Minuteman system, were brought in to investigate. They performed exhaustive diagnostics, examined every circuit, tested every component. They found nothing wrong. The missiles had simply stopped functioning all at once for no reason that conventional analysis could determine. The systems were brought back online, but the incident had exposed a vulnerability that no one had anticipated. Something had reached into the most secure military installation in America and demonstrated the ability to disable nuclear weapons at will. What makes the Malmstrom incident so significant is not just what happened, but how thoroughly it was documented and how consistently the witnesses have maintained their accounts over decades. This wasn't a case of unreliable testimony or recovered memories. Multiple officers, security personnel, and technicians witnessed different aspects of the same event, and their accounts corroborated one another in ways that made dismissal impossible. Salas himself was ordered to remain silent, told in no uncertain terms that discussion of the incident could jeopardize national security. For years, he complied, carrying the weight of what he had experienced in silence. But as decades passed and the Cold War ended, Salas began to speak publicly about what had occurred. His testimony was calm, detailed, and utterly credible. He didn't claim to know what the objects were or where they came from. He simply stated what had happened, documented fact by documented fact. Other officers who had been stationed at Malmstrom came forward as well, describing similar incidents that had occurred before and after the March event. It became clear that what Salas had experienced wasn't an isolated occurrence, but part of a broader pattern of interference with nuclear weapon systems. The implications were staggering. If these objects, whatever they were, could disable American nuclear missiles, they could presumably do the same to Soviet systems or Chinese systems or any other nation's arsenal. The balance of terror that had defined Cold War strategy, the concept of mutually assured destruction that had theoretically kept the peace, was revealed to be based on an assumption that might not be true. Our weapons weren't invulnerable. They could be neutralized by an outside force that didn't respect our security protocols, our technological sophistication, or our military might. Yet, crucially, the objects had not destroyed the missiles or triggered a launch. They had simply turned them off, demonstrating capability without aggression, showing power without violence. This restraint suggested something more complex than a simple threat. It suggested observation, testing, perhaps even a form of communication. The message, if there was one, seemed clear. We see your weapons, we can reach them, we can disable them, but we choose not to destroy them or you. The Malmstrom incident was not unique. As researchers began piecing together declassified documents, military testimonies, and freedom of information requests, a global pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Similar events had occurred at nuclear facilities across the United States, in the Soviet Union, in the United Kingdom, and anywhere else nuclear weapons were stored or deployed. The phenomenon respected no borders, acknowledged no political systems, and demonstrated no allegiance to any nation. It appeared wherever humanity had concentrated its most destructive power. In October 1968, Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota experienced its own dramatic encounter. Multiple security personnel reported seeing a large, luminous object hovering over missile silos. Radar operators tracked an unidentified target moving at impossible speeds and executing maneuvers that violated known principles of aerodynamics.
A B-52 bomber was vectored toward the location to investigate, and as it approached, the aircraft's electronic systems experienced unexplained disruptions. The crew watched as the object paced their aircraft, maintaining a fixed distance, before accelerating away at a speed no conventional aircraft could match. What distinguished the Minot case was the multiplicity of evidence. Ground observers saw the object visually, radar systems tracked it electronically, the B-52 crew witnessed it both visually and on their instruments. This convergence of independent observation methods made conventional explanations increasingly untenable. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's public-facing investigation program, classified the incident as a combination of atmospheric phenomena and misidentified aircraft, an explanation that satisfied no one who had actually been present. Across the northern tier of American missile bases, from Montana to North Dakota to Wyoming, the reports accumulated. Security teams described glowing orbs that seemed to patrol missile fields. Radar operators logged unknown contacts that appeared and disappeared without following any known flight patterns. Launch control officers reported brief but unexplained system anomalies that coincided with these aerial observations. Individually, each incident might be dismissed. Collectively, they formed an undeniable pattern. But the most shocking revelation came not from American sources, but from the former Soviet Union. After the collapse of the USSR in 1991, former military officers and intelligence officials began speaking about incidents that had been kept secret throughout the Cold War. The stories they told were eerily similar to American accounts. In 1982, at a nuclear missile base in Byelokoroviche, Ukraine, personnel witnessed a large disc-shaped object hovering over the facility. As they watched, the missile launch control systems began activating on their own, initiating countdown sequences without any human command. For 15 terrifying seconds, it appeared that nuclear missiles might launch autonomously, potentially triggering World War III. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the systems shut down. No launch occurred, no explanation was found. The parallels to Malmstrom were unmistakable. On opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, in nations that were mortal enemies, the same phenomenon was occurring. Unknown objects were appearing over nuclear facilities and demonstrating the ability to interfere with launch control systems. This suggested that whatever was responsible wasn't aligned with either superpower, but was operating according to its own agenda, one that seemed focused specifically on nuclear weapons regardless of who possessed them. Soviet scientists had been quietly investigating these incidents for decades. Dr. Felix Ziegel, a respected astronomer and military consultant, compiled extensive reports documenting the correlation between UFO sightings and nuclear facilities. His work, though politically sensitive, found support among defense analysts who recognized that the pattern was too consistent to dismiss. The KGB maintained files on American UFO incidents, trying to determine whether these represented some unknown American technology. Meanwhile, American intelligence was doing the same thing in reverse, wondering if the Soviets had developed capabilities that defied known physics. What neither side seemed to consider, or at least acknowledge publicly, was that the phenomenon might be entirely independent of human technology, terrestrial politics, or conventional understanding. The evidence suggested an external intelligence that was monitoring human nuclear capabilities without regard for national boundaries or political ideology. This intelligence appeared to have global reach, immediate response capability, and a technological sophistication that exceeded anything either superpower possessed. The pattern extended beyond land-based missile facilities to naval vessels carrying nuclear weapons. The USS Franklin D. Roosevelt, a Midway-class aircraft carrier that served throughout the Cold War, accumulated its own collection of unexplained incidents. Crew members reported glowing objects pacing the carrier group during operations in the Atlantic and Mediterranean.
In one documented case from 1962, a Navy photographer captured images of a metallic spherical object moving parallel to the carrier. The photographs were immediately confiscated by intelligence officers, and the photographer was instructed not to discuss what he had seen. Similar incidents occurred aboard other nuclear-capable vessels, suggesting that the phenomenon could operate equally well over open ocean as over land. What united all these cases, whether American, Soviet, or from other nations, was the consistent behavior of the objects. They appeared near nuclear weapons. They demonstrated flight characteristics beyond known technology. They sometimes interfered with electronic systems or weapons readiness. They left no physical trace upon departure, and they never, in any documented case, initiated hostilities or caused permanent damage. This restraint was perhaps the most puzzling aspect of the phenomenon. If these were reconnaissance platforms from an adversarial nation, why not weaponize the capability? If they represented a hostile intelligence, why merely observe rather than attack? The pattern suggested something more nuanced than simple military surveillance or preparation for conflict. If Malmstrom represented the most dramatic interference with nuclear weapon systems, the Bentwaters Woodbridge incident of December 1980 represented the most extensive close encounter with a structured craft at a nuclear weapons facility. This event, which unfolded over multiple nights in the forests of Suffolk, England, involved not distant lights or radar contacts, but a physical object that multiple witnesses approached, observed in detail, and in at least one case, physically touched. RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge were British bases operated by the United States Air Force during the Cold War. Though officially denied, these facilities housed one of the largest stockpiles of tactical nuclear weapons in Western Europe, a crucial component of NATO's defensive posture. On the night of December 26, 1980, security personnel at Woodbridge reported unusual lights descending into Rendlesham Forest, which bordered the base. Initial assumptions centered on an aircraft crash, and patrols were dispatched to investigate and render aid if needed. What airmen John Burroughs and Jim Peniston encountered in those woods defied their training and experience. According to their detailed accounts, a structured metallic craft sat silently among the trees. It was triangular in shape, approximately 9 feet across and 6 feet high, emitting a soft glow that illuminated the surrounding forest. The surface appeared smooth and warm to the touch, and strange symbols, described as resembling hieroglyphics, were visible on the hull. As the airmen approached, documenting everything according to their training, the object lifted vertically through the trees and disappeared into the night sky at a speed that seemed to violate physical laws. The following morning, investigators found physical evidence at the site. 3 triangular indentations in the forest floor formed a perfect equilateral triangle, suggesting something had rested there with significant weight. Radiation readings taken at the location registered above background levels, not dangerously high, but measurably elevated in a pattern that centered on the landing site. Branches overhead showed signs of heat damage. Photographs were taken, samples collected, and the entire scene was documented with the thoroughness expected of a military investigation at a strategic NATO facility. 2 nights later, the phenomenon returned, and this time, Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt led a larger team into the forest. Halt carried a portable tape recorder, and the audio he captured provides a real-time documentation of the encounter that remains one of the most compelling pieces of evidence in the entire UFO phenomenon. On the tape, Halt's voice remains professional but increasingly amazed as he describes glowing objects moving through the trees, a red pulsating orb that seemed to respond to the observers, and at one point, a beam of light that appeared to emanate from the object down toward the weapons storage area at Bentwaters. The implications of that beam were profound. Whatever was in those woods appeared to be specifically interested in the nuclear weapons stored at the base. It wasn't randomly exploring the countryside or observing the base in general.
It directed focused attention toward the precise location where NATO's tactical nuclear arsenal was housed. This targeted interest suggested sophisticated knowledge of the base layout and the specific nature of what was stored there, information that should have been among the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War. Holt filed an official memorandum summarizing the events, a document that would later become known as the Holt Memo. Written in careful military language, it nevertheless acknowledged that unidentified lights had been observed by multiple trained personnel, that physical evidence had been found at the landing site, and that the objects had demonstrated behaviors inconsistent with any known aircraft or natural phenomenon. This memo was forwarded to the British Ministry of Defense, but was not widely circulated or publicly acknowledged at the time. In subsequent years, Holt would become increasingly vocal about what had occurred, stating unequivocally in interviews and public testimony that the objects were under intelligent control and that both US and UK authorities had deliberately downplayed the incident. Other witnesses came forward, including additional base personnel who had observed the lights or been involved in the investigation. Their accounts corroborated one another in ways that made coordinated fabrication implausible. These were career military officers with security clearances and reputations to protect, not individuals seeking publicity or prone to sensationalism. The Bentwaters-Woodbridge incident raised questions that official investigations never adequately addressed. If these were experimental aircraft, whose aircraft were they, and why were they operating without clearance over a NATO nuclear weapons facility? If they were Soviet reconnaissance platforms, how had they achieved such technological sophistication, and why hadn't NATO detected them entering controlled airspace? If they were natural phenomena, how do we explain the structured craft, the physical landing traces, and the focused interest in the weapons storage area? Each conventional explanation failed to account for significant aspects of the evidence. What made this case particularly significant in the broader pattern was its location and timing. This occurred during the height of Cold War tensions at a facility that was absolutely central to Western nuclear deterrence strategy. The intrusion wasn't subtle or brief. It occurred over multiple nights, involved close observation by trained military personnel, and left physical evidence. The objects demonstrated clear awareness of where the nuclear weapons were stored and directed specific attention toward those locations. This wasn't passive observation. It was active investigation. As we step back from individual incidents and examine the accumulated evidence from 7 decades of encounters near nuclear facilities, certain patterns become undeniable. These patterns suggest not random appearances or misidentifications, but a directed intelligence with specific interests and sophisticated capabilities. Understanding what these patterns reveal requires moving beyond individual cases to see the broader picture they create. First, there is the geographical correlation. When researchers plot UFO sightings on maps and overlay them with the locations of nuclear facilities, the correlation is striking. Sightings cluster densely around weapons laboratories, testing sites, missile silos, nuclear-powered vessels, and waste storage facilities. This clustering is far too pronounced to be explained by chance or by the fact that these facilities happen to be in areas where people live and work. The correlation exists across nations, across decades, and across different types of nuclear installations. Whatever is behind these phenomena appears to have comprehensive knowledge of where humanity stores, develops, and deploys nuclear materials. Second, there is the temporal correlation. The first wave of intensive sightings began immediately after the Trinity Test in 1945 and increased dramatically as nuclear weapons proliferated through the 1950s and 60s. Major nuclear milestones, the Soviet Union's first test, the development of thermonuclear weapons, the deployment of missiles on submarines, were each followed by increases in reported activity near the relevant facilities. It's as if each advancement in nuclear technology triggered renewed interest or concern from whatever intelligence is responsible for these observations.
Third, there is the behavioral consistency. Across thousands of reported encounters spanning multiple decades and nations, the objects behave in remarkably similar ways. They demonstrate flight characteristics that exceed known human technology, including sudden acceleration, stationary hovering, sharp-angle turns at high speed, and the ability to operate in multiple mediums: air, space, and in some cases, water. They approach nuclear facilities with apparent purpose, often hovering directly over specific installations such as missile silos or weapons bunkers. They sometimes, but not always, cause temporary disruptions to electrical or weapons systems. And they invariably depart without engaging in hostile action, leaving no debris and making no attempt at communication using conventional means. Fourth, there is the response pattern from authorities. Across nations and political systems, the official response to these incidents has been remarkably uniform. Initial investigations are conducted, often quite thorough ones involving significant resources. Witnesses are debriefed, sometimes required to sign non-disclosure agreements. Physical evidence, when it exists, is collected and classified. Public statements, if made at all, offer conventional explanations that often don't align with the documented evidence. And then, most tellingly, the incidents are archived and further inquiry is discouraged. This pattern suggests that authorities worldwide recognize something significant is occurring, but have made a collective decision that public acknowledgement would serve no useful purpose, or might even be destabilizing. The technological sophistication demonstrated by these objects deserves particular attention. The flight characteristics routinely reported: instant acceleration from hovering to hypersonic speeds, 90-degree turns at high velocity, hovering silently without visible means of propulsion, operation in multiple mediums without apparent modification, represent capabilities that remain beyond human achievement, even with 21st century technology. More significantly, the apparent ability to remotely disable nuclear weapon systems, bypassing multiple layers of hardened security and fail-safe mechanisms, suggests an understanding of these systems that exceeds that of their designers. This last point is particularly troubling from a national security perspective. The entire doctrine of nuclear deterrence rests on the assumption that launch decisions remain under human control and that weapon systems are invulnerable to external interference. The incidents at Malmstrom, Byelokoroviche, and numerous other facilities demonstrate that this assumption may be false. Something has repeatedly shown the capability to reach into our most secure installations and manipulate systems that should be unreachable. The fact that this capability has been demonstrated without being weaponized, without being used to trigger launches or create catastrophe, suggests restraint rather than inability. The restraint itself is revealing. In decades of documented interference with nuclear weapons, there has never been an incident where the phenomenon caused a weapon to detonate, triggered an unauthorized launch, or created a situation that resulted in human casualties. The interference has been temporary, reversible, and, in a strange way, almost surgical in its precision. Systems are disabled briefly and then restored to function. This pattern suggests either a very sophisticated testing protocol or a deliberate demonstration of capability designed to send a message without causing harm. Some researchers have proposed what they call the nuclear monitoring hypothesis, which suggests that humanity's development of nuclear weapons triggered surveillance by an external intelligence concerned about the implications of such technology. This hypothesis aligns with the timing of initial sightings, the geographic concentration around nuclear facilities, and the specific behaviors observed. It also offers a framework for understanding the restraint. If the purpose is monitoring rather than interference or attack, then the pattern makes sense. Appear where the weapons are, demonstrate awareness and capability, but avoid actions that might trigger the very nuclear exchange you're monitoring. Others have suggested that these incidents represent a form of communication, a way of sending messages to those who control nuclear arsenals without using language or conventional contact. The message would be simple but profound. Your weapons are visible. They are not as secure as you believe, and there are consequences to their use that extend beyond your understanding. From this perspective, each incident is a gentle but firm reminder that humanity's nuclear capabilities are being observed by something with the power to intervene if necessary. A darker interpretation, favored by some intelligence analysts, is that these encounters represent reconnaissance for potential future action, an unknown intelligence systematically mapping human nuclear capabilities, testing response times, probing security measures, and developing the capability to neutralize our weapons if some threshold is crossed. This interpretation sees the restraint not as benevolence, but as the patience of an intelligence that is methodically preparing for a contingency it hopes never to use. The phenomenon did not end with the Cold War. As we moved into the 21st century with more sophisticated monitoring technology, better camera systems, and multiple overlapping sensor networks, the sightings not only continued, but in some ways became more frequent and better documented. The objects, whatever they are, adapted to our improved detection capabilities but did not cease their activities. If anything, the modern era has provided better evidence while raising even more troubling questions about what these intelligences want and what they might do. Between 2004 and 2015, the Hanford site in Washington state, a former nuclear weapons production complex and current radioactive waste storage facility, experienced a series of incidents involving luminous objects hovering over the most contaminated areas. Security contractors reported glowing orbs that appeared repeatedly, sometimes for extended periods, maintaining fixed positions over underground waste tanks that contain some of the most hazardous radioactive materials in the United States. Helicopters were dispatched, thermal imaging cameras deployed, but the objects remained unidentified and seemingly unconcerned about the human response. What's particularly significant about the Hanford sightings is that they occurred at a facility no longer actively producing nuclear weapons, but still managing the legacy of that production. The objects weren't appearing over active missile silos or deployed warheads, they were appearing over stored radioactive waste. This suggests that the interest might extend beyond weaponized nuclear materials to nuclear contamination in general, raising the possibility that these intelligences are monitoring not just our weapons, but the broader environmental impact of our nuclear activities. The U.S. Navy's experiences in the 2010s brought the phenomenon to a new level of public awareness. Between 2014 and 2015, pilots from the USS Theodore Roosevelt Carrier Strike Group encountered unknown objects almost daily during training operations off the East Coast. These objects, described as cube-shaped forms inside transparent spheres, demonstrated flight characteristics that violated known physics. They could remain stationary in high winds, accelerate instantly to hypersonic speeds, and operate for extended periods without any visible means of propulsion or fuel. What distinguished these modern Navy encounters was the quality of documentation. The objects were captured on multiple sensor systems simultaneously: gun camera footage, radar tracking, infrared targeting pods, each providing corroborating evidence from different detection methods. The famous gimbal and go fast videos released by the Pentagon show objects rotating in flight and moving at speeds that sensor systems could barely track. These weren't grainy photographs or single witness accounts. These were military-grade sensor recordings from multiple platforms, authenticated by the Department of Defense and confirmed by numerous trained observers. Lieutenant Ryan Graves, one of the Navy pilots involved in these encounters, testified before Congress that the objects were observed regularly and represented a serious safety concern. In his carefully worded testimony, he emphasized that these were not experimental military aircraft, not drones, not balloons, and not any known atmospheric phenomenon. They were structured objects under apparent intelligent control, operating in restricted military airspace with impunity. And while these particular encounters didn't occur directly over nuclear facilities, the Carrier Strike Group was conducting training for operations that might involve nuclear-capable aircraft. The establishment of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, known as AATIP, revealed that the Pentagon had been taking these encounters far more seriously behind closed doors than public statements suggested. From 2007 to at least 2012, this classified program investigated UAP incidents with a focus on those that occurred near sensitive military installations, including nuclear facilities. Though most of AA-TIP's findings remain classified, the program's very existence confirmed that at the highest levels of American defense establishment, the phenomenon was recognized as real and potentially significant to national security. The successor to AA-TIP, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or AARO, continues this work with a broader mandate. In testimony before Congress, AARO officials confirmed that UAPs have been observed near sensitive military installations and that some incidents involve nuclear facilities. They acknowledged that the objects demonstrate flight characteristics beyond known human technology and that their presence near strategic assets represents a potential intelligence and security concern. However, they stopped short of speculating about the origin or intent of these phenomena, maintaining that investigation is ongoing. What's changed in the modern era is not the phenomenon itself, but our ability to document it and the willingness of authorities to acknowledge, however grudgingly, that something real is occurring. The stigma that for decades kept witnesses silent and prevented serious scientific investigation has begun to erode. Military personnel can now report UAP encounters without fear of ridicule or career damage. Civilian scientists can study the phenomenon without being dismissed as fringe researchers. And slowly, very slowly, the wall of official denial is developing cracks. Yet the fundamental questions remain unanswered. The objects continue to appear near nuclear facilities. They continue to demonstrate capabilities that exceed our technology. They continue to observe our most sensitive military operations with apparent ease. And they continue to avoid hostile action while making their presence unmistakably known. This pattern, now documented across 8 decades, suggests purpose and persistence that goes well beyond casual observation or random occurrence.
As we near the end of this exploration, we must confront the question that underlies everything we've discussed. What does this pattern of surveillance mean for humanity? What are these intelligences, assuming that's what they are, actually doing? And perhaps most importantly, what should we do about it? The evidence accumulated over 7 decades points to several inescapable conclusions. First, something with capabilities far beyond current human technology has been systematically monitoring humanity's nuclear weapons since we first developed them. Second, this monitoring appears purposeful rather than random, focused specifically on nuclear facilities rather than human activity in general. Third, whatever is responsible has demonstrated both the capability and the restraint to interfere with nuclear weapons systems without causing permanent damage or triggering catastrophic incidents. Fourth, this phenomenon has been documented across all nations that possess nuclear weapons, suggesting it operates on a global scale without regard for human political boundaries. These conclusions lead us to some uncomfortable questions. If we are being monitored, by whom or by what? The extraterrestrial hypothesis, while impossible to prove definitively, aligns well with the observed characteristics. The objects demonstrate technology that exceeds human capabilities by margins that don't suggest incremental advancement, but rather fundamental differences in understanding physics. They operate globally and have done so consistently since the dawn of the nuclear age. They show no evidence of terrestrial origin or allegiance to any human nation or faction.
But whether the intelligence is extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or something else entirely may be less important than understanding its apparent intentions. The pattern of behavior suggests not conquest or attack, but observation and occasional intervention. The interventions, when they occur, are precisely calibrated to demonstrate capability without causing harm.
This suggests either a monitoring protocol designed to gather information without disrupting the observed system, or a more active guardianship designed to prevent nuclear catastrophe without directly controlling human decisions. Some researchers have suggested that humanity might be under a form of cosmic quarantine, observed by advanced civilizations concerned about whether we will destroy ourselves with nuclear weapons before we mature enough to be trusted with such technology. From this perspective, the interventions at facilities like Malmstrom and Byelokoroviche might be demonstrations, warnings designed to make clear that our nuclear arsenals are not as invulnerable as we believe, and that their use would not go unnoticed or unopposed by forces beyond our control. Others view the phenomenon through a more biological lens, comparing it to how scientists might observe a colony of bacteria that has unexpectedly developed a capability for self-destruction. The observation might be purely scientific, monitoring to see whether the organism will stabilize, evolve past the destructive phase, or eliminate itself. The occasional interventions might be comparable to a scientist occasionally adjusting conditions in an experiment, not to control outcomes, but to prevent premature termination of an interesting observation.
A more unsettling possibility is that the monitoring serves a purpose we cannot understand with our current framework of knowledge and experience. Perhaps nuclear weapons produce effects or signals that propagate through dimensions or spaces we don't yet recognize. Perhaps the detonation of nuclear devices affects the structure of space-time in ways that are significant to civilizations with a more complete understanding of physics. From this perspective, the interest in our nuclear weapons might not be about us at all, but about the side effects of technologies we use without fully understanding their implications. Regardless of the specific motivation, certain implications are clear. First, we are not alone in the universe, or at least not alone in our cosmic neighborhood. Something intelligent exists beyond humanity, something with technology and capabilities that make our most advanced achievements look primitive. Second, this intelligence has been observing us for decades, and we have been unable to prevent that observation or understand its full scope. Third, our nuclear weapons, the ultimate expression of human power and the foundation of strategic deterrence from multiple nations, are vulnerable to interference by forces beyond our control. This last point has profound implications for international security and nuclear strategy. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, which has theoretically prevented nuclear war for decades, rests on certain assumptions. One of those assumptions is that nuclear weapons remain under the control of their possessor nations and cannot be disabled or triggered by external forces. The incidents we've documented challenge that assumption fundamentally. If nuclear arsenals can be neutralized by an outside intelligence, then the balance of terror that has maintained a fragile peace becomes significantly more complex.
Some argue that this external monitoring might actually be stabilizing, that the knowledge that nuclear weapons use is being observed by a technologically superior intelligence might make their use less likely. If world leaders believe that nuclear launch might be prevented, or that nuclear detonation would trigger intervention by forces beyond human control, they might be more cautious about initiating nuclear war. From this perspective, the phenomenon, while unexplained and uncontrolled, might paradoxically contribute to nuclear restraint. Others warn that relying on unknown external forces for nuclear stability is dangerous precisely because we don't understand their criteria, motivations, or reliability. We don't know under what circumstances they might intervene, or what threshold of nuclear activity might trigger a response. We don't know if their apparent restraint would continue indefinitely, or if there are scenarios where observation might transition to more active intervention. Building security doctrines around assumptions about unknown intelligences seems profoundly unwise. So, where does this leave us? We have compelling evidence gathered over decades, documented by credible witnesses, corroborated by multiple sensors and investigation methods, that something unknown is monitoring humanity's nuclear activities. We have no definitive explanation for what this something is, where it comes from, or what it ultimately wants. And we have governments and institutions that have chosen, for complex and perhaps understandable reasons, to maintain official silence while quietly investigating behind closed doors. The path forward requires several simultaneous efforts. First, we need more transparency about what has been documented and what is known. The classified files, the suppressed investigations, the witness testimonies that were buried for national security reasons, these need to be examined in the light of day. Not all at once, perhaps, and not without careful consideration of genuine security concerns, but the default of secrecy has served primarily to prevent serious scientific and public engagement with a phenomenon that clearly has significant implications for humanity. Second, we need rigorous scientific investigation using the full range of modern detection and analysis tools. The stigma that has kept mainstream science away from this topic needs to be overcome. Physicists, aerospace engineers, astronomers, data scientists, these professionals should be encouraged to apply their expertise to understanding these phenomena without fear of career damage or ridicule. The military and intelligence communities have gathered extensive data, but they are not primarily scientific institutions. We need scientific rigor brought to bear on this evidence.
Third, we need international cooperation and information sharing. If this phenomenon is global, as all evidence suggests, then responses and investigations need to be coordinated across nations. The incidents at Malmstrom and Byelokoroviche were strikingly similar because they involved the same phenomenon approaching different nations' nuclear arsenals. Information sharing about encounters, sensor data, and analysis might reveal patterns that individual nations cannot detect alone. Fourth, we need public education and preparation. If disclosure is coming, whether through government acknowledgement or through continued accumulation of undeniable evidence, the public needs context and framework for understanding what is being disclosed. The goal should not be to provoke fear or panic, but to build realistic understanding of phenomena that appear real, significant, and ongoing. The conversation needs to move beyond the sensationalism of flying saucers and little green men to engage seriously with questions about humanity's place in a universe that appears to contain other intelligences. Fifth, we need to think seriously about communication and protocol. If we are being observed, perhaps we should consider attempting deliberate contact, or at least making clear our awareness of the observation. Some researchers have proposed establishing protocols for response to UAP encounters, guidelines that would allow witnesses to document experiences systematically and authorities to respond in coordinated ways. Others suggest that intentional signaling, using methods that might be detectable by advanced intelligence, could open channels of communication if such communication is possible or desired.
Sixth, we need to reconsider our nuclear posture with the knowledge that our arsenals may not be as secure or as invulnerable as strategic planning assumes. This doesn't necessarily mean disarmament, though it might strengthen arguments for reducing nuclear stockpiles. But it does mean acknowledging an additional variable in nuclear strategy: the presence of external observation and potential intervention by forces we don't control. This variable should inform risk assessment, deployment decisions, and crisis management protocols. The phenomenon we've explored represents something profound, perhaps the most significant development in human history. For the first time, we have compelling evidence that we are not alone, that other intelligences exist and are taking an active interest in humanity's activities, particularly our most destructive technologies. This evidence doesn't come from fringe researchers or conspiracy theorists. It comes from military personnel, radar operators, nuclear security officers, aerospace engineers, and intelligence analysts. It's documented in declassified files, sensor recordings, and sworn testimony. Yet, despite this evidence, the topic remains marginalized, discussed more often in terms of entertainment and speculation than serious inquiry. This disconnect between the quality of evidence and the level of serious engagement represents a collective failure of curiosity and courage. We have chosen, as a civilization, to ignore or dismiss something that challenges our understanding of reality, because acknowledging it would be uncomfortable, complicated, and would raise questions we don't know how to answer.
But ignoring reality doesn't change it. The objects continue to appear. The patterns continue to hold. The surveillance continues unabated. And every year that passes without serious engagement means we miss opportunities to learn, to prepare, to understand what might be one of the most important truths about our existence. We are being watched. We have been watched for decades. And whoever or whatever is doing the watching has demonstrated both the capability and the interest to interact with our most powerful weapons. This isn't a problem that will resolve itself through continued denial. It's not a phenomenon that will disappear if we refuse to acknowledge it. The evidence suggests we are dealing with an intelligence that operates on its own timeline according to its own priorities, utterly indifferent to whether we choose to recognize its presence. The only question is whether we will engage with this reality on our own terms, through deliberate investigation and thoughtful preparation, or whether we will continue to react passively as encounters accumulate and the phenomenon continues regardless of our acknowledgement.
We began this journey by asking you to consider what it means that our nuclear facilities have been under observation for over 70 years. We've examined the evidence, from Trinity to Malmstrom, from Bentwaters to Hanford, from American silos to Soviet bases to modern Navy encounters. We've seen consistent patterns of behavior, repeated demonstrations of advanced capability, and a clear focus on humanity's nuclear activities. The evidence is substantial, the witnesses credible, the documentation extensive. What we haven't found are easy answers or simple explanations. The phenomenon remains, in fundamental ways, unexplained. But unexplained is not the same as unexplainable, and the absence of definitive answers doesn't invalidate the reality of what has been observed, documented, and experienced by thousands of trained professionals across decades. The nuclear age brought humanity both unprecedented power and unprecedented peril. We developed the capability to harness the fundamental forces of matter and to weaponize that capability on a scale that threatens planetary catastrophe. And something noticed, something responded, something has been watching ever since, appearing at our most sensitive facilities, demonstrating awareness of our most closely guarded secrets, occasionally interfering in ways that reveal our vulnerabilities, while avoiding the catastrophic consequences that such interference might trigger. Whether this represents surveillance, guardianship, scientific observation, or something we lack the framework to understand, the implications are profound. We are not masters of our own nuclear destiny in the way we believed. We are being observed by intelligence or intelligences with capabilities that exceed our own. And the comfortable assumption that humanity alone controls the nuclear threshold has been revealed as, at best, incomplete. Moving forward requires courage, the courage to acknowledge what has been documented despite its challenges to our worldview. It requires humility, accepting that we might be dealing with intelligence and technology beyond our current understanding. It requires scientific rigor, applying our best analytical tools to phenomena we cannot yet explain. And it requires wisdom,
recognizing that how we respond to this reality will shape humanity's future in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. The objects are still there, still watching, still appearing near our nuclear facilities with the same regularity and purpose they've shown for 70 years. The question is not whether this phenomenon is real. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is what we choose to do with that reality, how we respond to the knowledge that we are observed, and what it means for humanity's future that we are, quite possibly, not alone in our nuclear journey through an uncertain cosmos. The lights continue to appear above the silos. The systems occasionally fail and recover. The surveillance continues, and the silence from those who know the most remains, for now, unbroken. But that silence cannot hold forever, and when it finally breaks, the world will need to be ready for what follows.